English translation. 217th contact. Friday, 8th of May, 1987. Oro 2:07 hours.
Nice to see you again, my friend. I have missed you already. Be welcomed.
Unfortunately, it was not possible for me to come earlier.
All is good. It was not a reproach, just a comment. If you permit, I would like to begin with some questions.
I have no objection to that.
A few questions arose in reference to the places of the fulfillment of guidelines, as you have used these at earlier times to separate the fallible ones from society. How did everything work? Were the fallible ones supervised at the isolated locations, or simply left to their fate? How was everything secured so that they could not break out, etc.?
The places of fulfillment of guidelines were, in every case, very much secluded from any civilized area. The beginning of these places was, unfortunately, inglorious, for during the first 16 years of their implementation, the fallible ones, each one separated according to gender, were provided with everything necessary for living and learning, set out at the places of fulfillment of guidelines, and left to themselves. However, long-range alert barricades and security barricades were given so that no one could escape. But this method was not sufficient, for since the fallible ones were simply left on their own, several power groups emerged among them, which exercised terror among the other fallible ones. Thus, it led to uprisings and to murder and mayhem, including individuals who rose up against one another out of hatred and revenge, as well as out of resentment, and for many other reasons. At the same time, homosexual relations and the resulting jealousy also played an important role. Consequently, new ways for the fulfillment of guidelines were sought for the fallible ones, whereby new security measures became effective. So from then on, the places of fulfillment of guidelines were secured by guards who, on the one hand, exercised their waking functions among the fallible ones at the isolated locations, and, on the other hand, also outside of these within a particular area. This was the case at least during the first period, which lasted for a few centuries, after which other methods were then brought to application, because the direct surveillance carried out by the human guards did not work satisfactorily. The direct contact of the security guards with the fallible ones at the places of fulfillment of guidelines led to reciprocal differences as well as to reciprocal attacks, through which there were often uprisings and deaths on both sides. For this reason, although other reasons also played a role, new ways were sought, which eventually led to the fallible ones being taken to absolutely secure and electronically monitored locations. Therefore, direct security personnel were no longer necessary, and through this, the hazard of collisions and differences between the fallible ones and the guards was excluded. However, in order also to ensure the safety of the fallible ones among one another, so that even among them no differences and uprisings as well as no power groups would emerge, and thus murder and mayhem would also be prevented. Our early safety scientists created electronic behavioral chips, that is to say, security chips, which were implanted into the brains of the fallible ones. These chips were designed in such a manner that they steered the behavior of the fallible ones in a wise that no aggression and lust for power, as well as no hatred and no vindictiveness could appear. Rather, everything in relation to this was reduced in such a manner that a dampening of these destructive concerns occurred, and in each case all resulting matters were processed in peace and with consideration. Thus, everything was aligned toward the fact that all occurring things and matters were considered thoroughly and rationally, and no differences and degeneracies, etc., appeared any more. But this does not mean that the fallible one's own will and their own freedom of choice would have been taken from them, for that was the case in no wise. In fact, they were completely free in this as well as in every other form, which also has reference to their freedom of movement and freedom of action. The only restrictions were that, on the hand, a secured place of fulfillment of guidelines was given, from which no one could escape, and that, on the other hand, no criminal or otherwise ausartende, to get very badly out of control of the good human nature, actions could occur any more because these were prevented by the programming of the implanted chips. The development did not stand still, however, because the scientists researched further and improved the electronic products, through which everything became much better. But the real great turning point first came when gene technology was taken into consideration, through which the fallible ones could be treated in such a manner that they were separated from their criminal or other ausartenden to get very badly out of control of the good human nature, actions, and, thus, completely cured of them. This meant that gradually, the places of fulfillment of guidelines became superfluous and eliminated. During the first time, if it was the case that fallible ones were banished for life, without them ever being able to establish contact with the outside world, then this measure was gradually relaxed and, in the end, eliminated altogether, once the fallible ones could be completely cured of their criminal or other ausartigen, having gotten very badly out of control of the good human nature forms through genetic manipulation and be released into society. This gene manipulative healing method was further investigated and further developed, and indeed, even in reference to all hereditary diseases and immunodeficiencies as well as physical and organic deformities, but also in terms of disorders of consciousness and inheritable psychological disorders, etc. The development progressed rapidly, so already soon, early detections of gene damage of the aforementioned kind became possible, which naturally led to the fact that these cognitions were used and the genetic deformities, genetic abnormalities, and other harmful genetic influences were already repaired in the growing child in the womb. Thus, an irrefutable law has been enforced since then, namely that every child, so every girl and every boy, is to be arranged into a gene examination, that is to say, a gene analysis, at the prenatal age of 7 months. Since then, since this law gained validity and became observed absolutely, it is valid with us that every crime or other degeneration, as well as every inheritable disease of the body and its organs, every immunodeficiency of any kind, and every form of harmful aggressiveness, jealousy, and vindictiveness are just as non-existent as also hatred, envy, desire for validity, egoism, and many other characteristics that bring the human being discord, unkindness, and other harms. But at the same time, it should be noted that through this, our own decision in all matters and concerns is in no wise impaired. Also, our drive for self-preservation and our drive for self-defense are not impaired if this is demanded.
Thanks. That should actually suffice. On my great journey with Ptah, he told me that our scientists are mistaken in their acceptance that in the explosions on the sun, only 2 million degrees of heat would arise. But unfortunately, I now do not remember what he said. I mean, what degrees of heat he said, which arise in reality. Do you perhaps know about this?
I am not aware of what you two discussed in this regard, but it actually is not true that only 2 million degrees of heat should arise in the solar explosions. In fact, it is around a 1,000,000,000,000 degrees.
Now that you mention it, I remember again. Yes, Ptah spoke of around 1,000,000,000,000 degrees. But now, something else. Particularly in Switzerland and in Germany. A lot of advertising is always made for how milk should be healthy, and a calcium dispenser. However, Ptah once said that this does not correspond to the truth. I also heard this repeatedly from physicians and scientists. What is it?
What Ptah explained to you and what you have otherwise heard repeatedly about milk is of correctness. Milk is very well a great source of energy, but not necessarily healthy and tolerable for every person. But in particular, milk may not be awarded those health values that are publicized. For example, by the milk producers and by the responsible persons of the milk industry and other utilizers of milk who produce food and beverages. In fact, milk, particularly cow's milk, contains many substances that are not exactly to be designated as health-promoting. Unfortunately, also in reference to milk calcium, many erroneous views and assertions prevail, for this does not promote bone structure, but is truly a robber of calcium, which removes the body's own calcium, even from the bones, through which there is not a supply of calcium to the body, and the bones through milk, but, on the contrary, a removal of calcium. And since, as a rule, too little calcium is already otherwise supplied to the body, as this is also the case for many vitamins, trace elements, and minerals, because today's foods, even fruits and vegetables that become more and more over-cultivated, contain less and less of these substances. The Earth human should take this separately or add this to their normal diet as a food supplement.
Also for this answer, I thank you, and it will certainly help so many humans. By the way, various people have also asked me about how healthy milk actually is. So I can now give them a useful answer, naturally pointing out that you have explained everything to me more exactly. But now, still a question about the prophecy of Enoch. You said that if it should actually come to World War III, then Switzerland also will not remain spared anymore. Namely for the reason that connections would be entered into with the UN, that is to say the United Nations, as well as with NATO and with the European Union. How then should these connections look, loose or firm? What is decisive in this regard?
The importance does not lie in a loose or free connection, but only in the fact that any mutual connection exists at all, whatever this may look like. In every form, Switzerland loses the actual status of its neutrality, which it could only preserve if it in no wise entered into any mutual or one-sided connections with binding contracts with the aforementioned organizations. Only through this would actual neutrality be preserved in truth, through which an attack on Switzerland would remain undone. But this will not be the case with great certainty, for already shortly after the turn of the millennium, through the irrationality of many Swiss citizens, misled by those who are irresponsible, a firm entry into the UN will take place, which will count as the beginning of the prospective catastrophe. If the prophecy of Enoch should fulfill itself, which can still be averted, however, if this people takes the initiative and brings the responsible persons of the government to reason. But this would have to mean that the majority of the population and the rulers become filled with actual reason and responsibility and act accordingly. To open themselves to the world, and this means not opening themselves to a nation and its people, to go into the clutches of some foreign-conditioned organizations, etc., and to forfeit their freedom and neutrality thereby. These are truthfully worth a lot more than the empty promises and lies of those who only strive for power and wealth, and to whom all infamous means are right, in order to deceive the people and rule over them. Unfortunately, like with other peoples of other nations, this will also be the case with the Swiss people, at least just with the majority of them who will be shouting for the accessions or other connections to the aforementioned organizations, through which it will first be recognized too late as to what the actual truth will be in regards to the connections and agreements with the EU, NATO, and UN. But once this realization comes, it will be very well too late to be able to slip out again through a suitable mesh. Therefore, it is only to be wished and hoped, and indeed, against all the gloomy prophecies, that the people, even those of Switzerland, will still become reasonable and prevent the impending disaster, which still, for a certain time, actually lies in the realm of possibility. Consequently, the prophetic threatening events do not have to arrive and do not have to fulfill themselves. And indeed, it is to be desired that the future will change for the better in the third millennium, and that the great time and the century of wars and strife among the Earth humans will finally be over. In order to achieve this, the Earth humans just need a little reason, understanding, and love, as well as the will to live together in peace with all humans, to respect and honor one another, and to help one another live.
Your word in the human being's ear. Actually, it would be nice if, in this so beautiful world, love and peace would finally prosper among all human beings. But it would probably still be too premature to cherish desires and hopes for this. So I think, because the overall thinking and behavior of the Earth human is still too focused on power, materialism, religion, and faith, as well as on selfishness, egotism, pride, self-glorification, jealousy, hatred, vindictiveness, racism, and on many other bad things and negative values, then that they could be taught what is better, and would also consciously and willingly change for the better. And even then, when the greatest misery and greatest catastrophe falls upon them, the Earth humans, they will only reflect upon the better for a short time, and to be sure, only for so long until their agonies and their memories slowly fade away, and they think that they have the upper hand again. Once they suffer agonies, fear, distress, and misery, then they are ready to make all possible and impossible promises, to pray to every imaginary god with endless words of gratitude and many sacrifices, which they would offer if they would just be released from their shit again. And once it is actually the case that the fear, need, misery, agony, trouble, and danger, etc. are over, then all the promises are forgotten and vanish like sound and smoke, after which the old lifestyle continues, and all harm and evil, all hatred, all unkindness and jealousy, racial hatred, and other forms of hatred, as well as vindictiveness and all other inhumane, dehumanizing, and inhuman things continue to grow rampant in a toxic and all-around destructive form that stinks to the high heavens.
It is frightening how clearly and plainly you see the facts and the reality, my friend. I would not like to be in your skin, as you tend to say, because you have to live on this earth among this humanity and fulfill your difficult task. If I just think of how you are still attacked and slandered for all your work and efforts, then I dread it. Moreover, I cannot understand at all how you endure all this and remain undauntedly loyal to your mission, even though you would actually have every reason to refrain from it.
Dear friend, I made a promise.
That is well known to me, and this word goes over everything for you.
Quite right. I cannot break any given word. But let's leave this, for I have something else to ask. Recently, we talked about the primeval times of the Earth, and the issue arose, which Sim Ya-Se also once talked about, that at least once on the Earth, there had been a global glaciation, that is to say, a total global ice age, which dates back about 600 million years. At the same time, the entire equatorial belt should have also been covered by many meters of thick ice and by enormous glaciers. This, along with the great ice ages and the small ice ages that repeatedly moved across the planet since ages ago, and will also continue to do so in the future. Through the total glaciation of global expanse, the entire Earth became a giant ball of ice, that is to say, an actual ice planet. In addition, I ask you, since you are also a geologist and an expert in terms of the ice ages and so on, how the Earth was able to turn into an ice planet at all, and how the enormous masses of ice were able to melt and then disappear again. At the earliest times, the planet was, nevertheless, a giant glowing ball before it solidified and formed actual land masses on which then, in the end, mountains raised themselves through inner Earth movements and processes, etc.
It corresponds to the truth that at early times on the Earth, the ice regions and glaciers had advanced into the tropical zones and also forced the equatorial regions and even the entire planet under a mantle of ice that was many meters thick. Thus, the ice planet Earth actually existed, just as Sim Ya-se explained to you. To your question of how the masses of ice melted again, I must explain the following. Normally, the Earth's surface is so strongly influenced by the sun through its rays that the upper layer of the Earth is warmed up. However, this only happens under normal conditions, and not with glaciers and large surfaces of ice, thus also not with small and great ice ages, because only the ice-free areas of the planet are affected and warmed up by the solar radiation, while the glaciers and other enormous white or bright greenish or bluish surfaces of ice too strongly reflect the sun's rays and, thus also the heat energy. Consequently, they cannot melt by the solar heat. If large surfaces of ice and glaciers spread out across the planet through planetary climate changes or through disturbances of the revolution of the planet around the sun or through any cosmic influence, then the Earth's surface naturally becomes brighter, through which, as I explained, the sunlight, that is to say the solar radiation, becomes much stronger than what is usually reflected. Through this, the planet takes in less and less solar heat, as this was also the case at that time with the Earth, and is the case with every small or great ice age. This is the reason why the planet's surface cools down more and more, and why the masses of ice can collect around it, grow unrestrainedly, and expand. Then, once a critical expanse and mass are reached, the climate tilts inexorably, and the total global freezing can no longer be stopped. This is the development of a global freezing of a planet, as this was also true for the Earth. Nevertheless, such a total freezing of a planet can more or less or even totally be dissolved by the planet's internal functions, which also happened on the Earth, on which even today there are still a large number of glaciers, which can be found throughout the whole world in smaller or larger forms in the mountains. But in addition, the areas of the Arctic and Antarctic may not be forgotten, which also remained after the small and great ice ages. Now, so that the Earth could free itself again from its enormous mantle of ice, the elementary, bubbling, inner life of the planet itself was decisive, namely the tremendous natural power of volcanism, through which the tremendous heat was generated, which eventually brought the ice crust of the Earth back to melting. Volcanoes have a direct connection to the Earth's interior and, with this, to the bubbling magma chambers, whereby the active volcanoes are also more active in their function, of course, during a global ice age. Thus, the volcanoes remain active and, through enormous eruptions, spew out huge masses of liquid lava as well as heat onto the planet's surface. But only the immediate ice-covered areas all around the volcanoes benefit from this as the vast sheets of ice melt. But in addition to the lava and the heat, the volcanoes also eject huge amounts of the finest dust particles, that is to say ash particles and so on and so forth, along with enormous masses of carbon dioxide, and these very factors are the ones that ensure that the heat of the sunlight is trapped in the atmosphere. But primarily, it is carbon dioxide that is decisive for this heat effect, for throughout the entire global ice age, which lasted on Earth for 12.47 million years, This gathered together in unimaginable mass in the atmosphere, heating it to about 57 degrees, which entailed that a tremendous global greenhouse effect arose, through which the enormous masses of ice slowly began to melt. By what means the global freezing dissolved up to the small areas at the North Pole and the South Pole, as well as in isolated mountain areas, etc. This was also the case on the ground, which took place about 600 million years ago. Of course, immense layers of clouds originated from the slow evaporation of the masses of ice, which surrounded the entire Earth as a closed cloud cover, and which, in turn, led to a renewed and even much more extreme climate change. Then, after many millions of years, it began to rain for the first time on Earth, and indeed in such immense masses that everything was set under water. This tremendous time of rain, during which the waters fell like a flood from the clouds to the ground, lasted for 142 years without interruption. And of course, new evaporations of the falling down water masses took place again and again, by what means the cloud formations were continuously fed, while the powerful volcanoes naturally remained active and constantly ejected new carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. The flood-like, falling down water masses combined in the atmosphere with this carbon dioxide, forming acid rain, from which then, over the course of time, natural lime developed on the Earth. This was the development of the Earth in relation to the total global freezing, which then also firstly formed the actual origin for the original emergence of the first micro-life forms of a single-celled kind, from which, over the course of millions of years and centuries, life forms of the water, land, and air evolved up to the higher kinds, after which then the Earth human emerged from the whole thing and evolved over many depths and heights to the current state. Until the global ice age around 600 million years ago, only thermal life forms, that is to say thermal bacteria, existed on the Earth in the scorching heat of the magma and lava, and these life forms were partially expelled from the hot springs of above-ground geysers, as well as from small or larger black funnels or chimneys rising high up at the bottom of the sea, and to be sure, along with the other primitive forms, from which, over the course of time, new unicellular life forms could evolve, which settled in the sands of the shores of the seas and other bodies of water, and evolved under or in the sand to multicellular life forms. But at the same time, comets as well as meteors and asteroids as well as interstellar clouds of microbes played a very important role. Once these came into the immediate vicinity of the Earth and fell down upon this, thereby bringing their microbes, etc. to the planet, which combined in part with the Earth's already developed life forms of a similar kind, and thereby created new life, or else life forms that were independently brought from space emerged from these. But in relation to the insemination of the Earth with respect to fauna and flora, it must be clearly said that what primarily relates to this did not proceed from the planet itself, but resulted through the inclusions from outer space, and to be sure, through comets, meteors, asteroids, dust particles, and even through the clouds of chemical elements drifting through free space as well as clouds of microbes, through which all the bacteria, fungi, lichens, mosses, viruses, and protozoa of various genera and species were brought to the Earth. The Earth human first emerged much later out of new amino acid connections, etc., which resulted from the decayed substances of plants and animals. The earliest human forms in this regard, which emerged from the planet itself, are to be backdated to 8 to 12 million years, but the actual hominid forms first appeared between 6 and 8 million years ago, from whose lines various human forms then developed over the course of time, but these were not of permanence, and, thus passed again. Then, from the same original line, still other and similar human life forms formed, so with the related human life forms, namely the simian beings, which still exist on the earth today in various species. The human beings who walked the earth at earlier times, such as over 20 or 120 or even more than 230 million years ago, were in no wise the so-called earth-made or earth-created ones, but rather extraterrestrials who came from the depths of space and who stayed here for a certain time or only visited the planet for a short time for expeditions or for major excursions. At that time, the areas of origin and homeworlds of these travelers from afar were to be found in your galaxy, so the Milky Way, but also in foreign galaxies.
So once more, from your words, it again follows clearly and plainly that humans are not descended from the ape line, but rather apes from the human line.
That is correct because the Darwinian theory of evolution, that the evolutionary line of Earth humans traces back to apes, is fundamentally wrong, for in truth, the evolutionary line of apes traces back to human beings. Darwin was a deceiver in relation to the human-ape evolutionary line theory, because he secretly worked on ape bones and ape skeletons with a filing utensil, in order to adapt them into his claim and false theory, and to present it to those scientists at that time who occupied themselves with the evolution of animals and humans. At first, they were completely impressed by Darwin's evidence, and spread Darwin's false claims and deceitful machinations across the globe as correct and as a true sensation. And once they discovered Charles R. Darwin's fraud, it was already too late to correct everything again. Consequently, everything took its course, and the fraudulently created evidence entered into the scientific annals as authenticity. Thus, it also spread among the people, and the erroneous teaching was born that the human being is descended from the ape, which is the exact opposite of what corresponds to the truth and correctness, that the ape is descended from the line of the human being.
The story is well known to me. Through his wrong machinations, Darwin probably created the greatest deception and the greatest lie that a scientist on the earth has ever created. Greater deception and greater lies were probably only created by the Americans, with their made-up first moon landing, as well as those through which religions and sects were created.
That is of correctness. But now, my friend, it is again enough for today, because you just do not look so good in the world that one could say that you are doing really well. So I want to say goodbye again, and hope that in my next visit I find you in a state of better health. So farewell then, and until we meet again. I will come again at the end of the month.
Then until we meet again, dear friend. So until the end of May. Please pay everyone my dearest greetings.